The views expressed on Skeptically Speaking are not necessarily the views of this station, its affiliates, sponsors, or advertisers.
Bring it on! The skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell gonna raise a little hell, metaphorically that is. 'Cause we're skeptically speaking.
Hello and welcome to Skeptically Speaking. I'm your host, Desiree Shell. This week we're talking about science and technology that affect your health. A little later we'll talk to Michael Kruse about Bad Science Watch, a new watchdog group working to inform Canadians about questionable science in government policies and consumer products. But first, we're joined by Alan Cassels, a drug policy researcher affiliated with the School of Health Information Sciences at the University of Victoria. Alan's worked on a variety of research and evaluation studies for the past 10 years, focusing on the impact of provincial drug benefits policies on consumers and examining how clinical research information and experience on drugs gets communicated to policymakers, prescribers, and consumers. And I wanted to say right up front that some of Alan's conclusions do challenge procedures that are considered standard by a lot of doctors and health policy scholars. So, as always, with this show and with life, if you hear something that doesn't sound right to you, do some research. Enjoy. So, what, pray tell, made you want to write about medical screening?
I think it's an absolutely fascinating topic, and it's something that we are exposed to really from cradle to grave. We may not think that our health is being continually evaluated and screened, but right from the day that you're born and they do a newborn screening test to when you're very elderly and they're thinking about doing a test to see if you're developing Alzheimer's or so on, we are exposed to medical screening throughout our lives. And a lot of it really goes without too much notice. We listen to our physician's advice, and we dutifully go and get our blood checked or our PSA tested if you're a man, or if you're a woman, you'll submit to perhaps an annual mammogram, without thinking that there are some pretty significant downsides to all the screening that happens on us.
Well, and this really started with a flyer that you got about full body scans, did it not?
Yeah, it did. It fell out of my newspaper one morning. It was a big yellow flyer, and it said the title was "A Full Body Scan Can Save Your Life." To which I said, "Wow, that's a very interesting claim. Let's dig into this." So, and it was a mobile screening unit down in Port Angeles, which is just across the Juan de Fuca Strait from Victoria, and they were offering $1,000 full body scans to Canadians. So you can go down there, pay your money, and be scanned by a high-tech computed tomography machine, which is supposed to find all kinds of potential abnormalities in your body. And this really shocked me, because here was what I thought was a relatively unproven and really unrecommended kind of screening that was being sold to the Canadian public, and under the pretense that it was going to save our lives. And so that really sort of kick-started my research, and I thought this needs to be looked into a little bit closer.
Speaking of full body scans, can they effectively screen for disease?
Well, they can find all kinds of things, but the kinds of high-tech, and I say high-tech, but also a fair amount of radiation. So these are the kinds of screening machines that can really look very closely at your organs. So your brain, your chest, and your liver, and your kidneys, and so on. And when they do that kind of screening, most people don't know that if they find something, there's a 99% chance of what they find is going to be a false positive, which is it will be something that appears to be abnormal, but actually isn't. It's something that is unusual and will lead to more screening and more biopsies and more probably unnecessary surgery. I looked at some of the research on what do they find when they take absolutely healthy people. So screening is about looking for disease in otherwise healthy people. These are people without any symptoms. You feel fine. You don't have any lumps or anything like that. And you go and get one of these. The average person is going to have something like 2.3 abnormalities in their body that will be found from a CT scan, from a full-body CT scan. And that just leads to a lot more investigations and what we would call overdiagnosis.
Well, that's interesting. So, okay, we have radiation, we have false positives and the resulting stress, but also you wrote about inappropriate reassurance.
Absolutely. So that is also the other side of screening, where there is the possibility that they'll find something that isn't unusual, and there's also the possibility that they won't. They will give you what they would call a clean bill of health, when in fact you do have something wrong with you. And that would be what we call a false negative. And so any screening test will have both a level of false positives and a level of false negatives. And what you need to know before you submit to a screen is what is the likelihood that if they find something, what's the probability that it's actually going to be something that I need to be worried about. Full body screen, you put that aside because it's really not. It's not recommended by any of the professional associations of radiology and so on. But if you look at something like mammography, which is annual recommended breast cancer screening for women, the level of false positives in mammography is really quite shockingly high. So they do find a lot of unusual things when they do X-rays of breasts, and those false positives lead to an awful lot of unnecessary biopsies, and in some cases surgery, women who would get mastectomies.
Well, maybe let's define that right now, because you said that there was a difference between screening and then something like a diagnostic test. So what is the difference?
Yeah, absolutely. The screening really is about taking healthy people and trying to find disease in a timely enough way that you can do something about it before it develops into something that is going to hurt you. And so, if a woman finds a lump in her breast by feeling, by touch, and goes in, that's a diagnostic procedure, and that is very recommended. You find anything unusual, you should do something about it. But if you step back and say, well, wouldn't it be better if we found the breast lump before it was the size of a walnut? Wouldn't it be better if we found it when it was the size of a pea? Or with the kinds of very advanced technology, they could find unusual things that are as big as the head of a pin. Well, do we really want to be finding these smaller and smaller and smaller abnormalities way before they ever develop into anything that could be a problem? And I think that's what screening has done, and it's both the success of screening and the failure of it, in that they can't distinguish these very small abnormalities from things that could go on to develop into something that would be a problem.
I'm going to be honest with you here. When I received your book from your publisher, I was somewhat concerned. A book about the medical screening underbelly, if you will, has the potential to be a big pharma conspiracy theory rant kind of thing. But your book is not that, really.
Thank you.
But it is very much more complicated than I had realized. So maybe just to put this out there, are you anti-big pharma, sir?
People ask me, so why are you so down on the drug industry? Well, I think just to clear the air, the industry produces very important drugs for a lot of conditions, and really improve people's lives immensely. At the same time, they're big companies that really depend on aggressive marketing, in many senses overselling the benefits and downplaying the harms of their treatments. I mean, we saw this just last week when there was the biggest healthcare fraud litigation case settled in the U.S., a $3 billion fine against Glaxo, one of the world's biggest drug companies, for doing essentially what I'm against, which is the deceptive marketing and the really kind of unethical way that drugs get pushed on what I would consider to be healthier and healthier people.
And actually, it's interesting, just going back to the full body scans, this is very much playing on people's misunderstanding or misinformation about what these scans actually are, a lot of these screenings. You actually did a survey about lay people's understanding of full body scans.
That's right, we did, and we found some very interesting things. We actually replicated a survey that was done in the U.S. Some colleagues at Dartmouth in Vermont had done a big survey asking people's opinions about full-body screening. And so we replicated this, and we found that, something like 60% of people, when asked whether they would rather have $1,000 or a full-body scan, they would opt for the full-body scan. When asked whether they thought that that scan was accurate, about 80% of the people would say yes, it would be an important thing to be able to find disease before it could go on to hurt you. The misunderstanding about this, I think, is really propelled by the marketers of these kinds of screenings. Now, I think in terms of the full body scan, they've really sort of backed away from the marketing of them as much as they were, say, 5 years ago. But you still see clinics, and there are clinics everywhere in major cities in Canada and the U.S. that are promoting full body scans, or come in and get your kidneys scanned, or your heart, come in for a calcium scoring on your or your coronary arteries and so on. So this idea that we can save your life by selling you a screening is really something that people have to be, I think, very skeptical of.
Now, in this instance specifically, these are private companies. These are not publicly funded clinics, at least we're talking about in Canada.
Absolutely. Private companies would be selling the individual screening, yes.
You're listening to Skeptically Speaking, and I'm talking with drug policy researcher Alan Cassels, author of Seeking Sickness, Medical Screening and the Misguided Hunt for Disease. Your book isn't specifically about public versus private screening. It's more about the effectiveness and necessity of a number of medical screening techniques.
Absolutely. And some of the screening is very is actually quite valuable. The two that I would point out as being important to consider would be, for women anyways, would be the Pap screening. So these are periodic tests to determine if they can find precancerous cells to try to avoid cervical cancer. And most, not being a woman, I can't really tell you what it's like to have a Pap smear, but from what I've heard anyways, is that for some women they'll find it very uncomfortable or somewhat uncomfortable, but that it's good to have a sense that there's some reassurance that you're not going to develop cervical cancer. We've seen instances where countries that have never had cervical cancer screening programs suddenly develop them and implement them in their country, that the rate of cervical cancer drops dramatically. And so we do know that those kinds of that kind of screening really reduces the rate of cervical cancer. As well with the colon cancer screening, the jury is a little bit more out on that, though it is one of those that I would say that's probably worth a second look and certainly worth a little bit of investigation. There are some simple tests that can be done to determine whether you might be at risk of having colon cancer. It's a relatively common disease, and it can be quite lethal. And finding it early and doing stuff to prevent it can really make a difference. So you wouldn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to screening. I think the major theme in my book, though, is that you certainly wouldn't go into any screening test of any kind without your eyes wide open and having a good sense of what the benefits can be, but also what the potential harms are.
Now, we have a number of questions that are coming in. Let's talk about the one from Miriam, because she wanted you specifically to talk about Pap tests.
Why were Pap tests suggested every year, but now they're suggested every 3 years?
Yes, because they've determined that, and I would say that is a theme that I've seen in a lot of screening programs, where they've determined that they're effective, and they say you should be doing it annually, and then they start realizing, well, actually, maybe that's too often. Certainly with the Pap smear, if you've been with the same partner and you haven't yet had an abnormal test, then there's a good chance that you'll continue to have abnormal tests, and reducing it to every 2 or every 3 years. We've seen that across the board of various jurisdictions, changing that. We've also seen where some women, or should I say the recommendation, though you should stop having a pap smear when you're in your 60s or early 70s. But there was an example that I relate in my book where a woman was in her 80s and she continued to go to her doctor. She went to this doctor, Warren Bell, up in the Salmon Arm, and said to the doctor, "I would like to get my annual pap smear." And he said his jaw hit the floor with a thud. He was so shocked that she would still want to be screened. And when asked, why would you continue to want a pap smear when you're way beyond the age at which it would make any difference, her answer would be like the answer that anyone would give, which is, I'm doing this because I've always been told to do it.
And I think that's really the problem, is we assume, since we're told to have a screening, we get a screening. That's about it.
Yes, exactly. And, screening makes sense between certain ages. So the pap smear might between when you're, from the age at which you're sexually active to, say, in your early 60s. Getting a pap smear when you're 75 or 85 probably doesn't make a lot of sense, nor does it make a lot of sense to be performing mammography or PSA testing on men when they're in their 70s or 80s, because the potential benefits are really quite small.
Now, you mentioned that the pap test is actually sort of a success story in screening, because it actually did lead to reduced deaths due to cervical cancer. But how precisely does one attribute that, the reduction in deaths due to screenings versus reductions in deaths due to, let's say, developing treatments that are more effective?
Yeah, I think it's both. And in fact, it's really hard to tease out what have been the benefits of screening, though with stuff like mammography, the rate of breast cancer deaths, by the way, in Canada and the U.S. and around the world really have been slowly dropping, over the last 20 years. A lot of the screening advocates would say, well, that's because of mammography is so effective. But when you tease out the actual effects, it has actually very little to do with the mammography. It has almost everything to do with the fact that they're finding much better treatments for women. So women who get breast cancer now are much more likely to survive. That doesn't have anything to do with screening. That has to do with basically better medicine and knowing how to use the drugs better. We
have a question from Greg Layden.
What percentage of women who have actual breast cancer discovered this with a screening through mammography?
Yeah, I can't answer that. I don't actually know. I would estimate that it would be fairly small, though I'm not sure. I think what does happen is a lot of women who do go in to get checked out for a diagnostic screen, it's because they have felt a lump or they have something unusual that they actually feel, and it's at a point that it's not visible, but they can sense it.
We have a question from Whitney.
In your opinion, are there any screening techniques where the benefits definitely outweigh the risks?
So I assume the pap test is one of those.
Yeah, but again, the pap test would be one of them, and again with the caveat that if it's being used in the appropriate ages and for the appropriate interval. People who, the general principle, I think, that I would sort of say in relation to this answer is that it depends on what risk you're at. If you are naturally at higher risk for having a particular condition, and there is some benefit to being screened for that condition and finding the disease earlier than it would be normally, then you would have a much higher chance of benefiting. I mean, an example might be if you're, what's an example? If you're a gay male and sexually active and at a high risk of having HIV, there is a chance that you would much more benefit from having screening for HIV than, say, just an average heterosexual male, because you're in a different category. So back to the question of which is the screening tests that have proven definitive benefits, it really depends on what the risk is to start with. And the general principle being if you're at high risk, you have a higher chance of benefiting.
Okay, I would like to use sort of an example from your book, sort of go through this entire thing, cholesterol screening, because this one was actually quite shocking to me. So first of all, how do they screen for that?
Well, it's a simple blood test, and oftentimes you will go to your doctor, and he or she may say, let's do some blood work on you. Now, this is a person, you might not have any symptoms, any kind of symptoms of heart disease or anything like that. They'll take a sample of your blood, or he'll send a requisition for you to go to a lab. They'll take a sample of your blood, and they'll run it through a number of tests. And one of the tests might be to check to see what your levels of HDL, LDL, triglycerides. These are substances that are naturally exist in your blood. And if there is a level of high cholesterol, now, and I won't give you the definition because it depends on the jurisdiction, and it depends on, the definition seems to change frequently. But if your doctor determines that you have a high level of cholesterol, he or she may recommend that you start taking a cholesterol-lowering drug or modify your diet or do other things. I actually think that for healthy people who have no history of heart disease, there is no good evidence that having a cholesterol test will benefit you. And I know your listeners are going to be shocked by that statement.
Indeed.
But, I've been looking at the cholesterol monster now for 15 years, and as far as I can tell, the benefits of testing for cholesterol are really quite marginal and very much restricted to those people who have had previous heart attacks or heart disease. Those people who have those conditions and have high cholesterol, they may benefit somewhat from taking a cholesterol-lowering drug. The rest of us who are healthy, men, women, older people, otherwise these are people without otherwise having any symptoms or any existing heart disease, will not benefit from having their cholesterol tested.
See, this is actually what I find so interesting is even if you do go in and you get tested and you find out you have high cholesterol, they're going to prescribe you statins.
Yeah.
And there are downfalls to statins, are there not?
But by all means, and let's face it, if you have high cholesterol and are otherwise healthy, for them to make you healthier, those drugs have to do a lot. The bar is very high. And I think that the growing number of adverse effects relating to statin drugs, now these are drugs that are widely used. Probably 20 to 25% of the people listening to this program are taking a cholesterol-lowering drug or know somebody who is. Those drugs cause enzyme breakdown. They can cause muscle weakness. They can affect cognitive abilities, so people's memory and thinking. And they can cause irritability and mood changes. And, there really is quite a wide range of adverse effects. And you might say, well, it's worth having those effects if it's going to reduce my risk of heart attack or stroke.
Right.
But then you go and look at the benefit side of things, and those benefits are only seen in people that have pre-existing heart disease. If you don't, if you're otherwise healthy, there are no benefits for altering your cholesterol. So you're exposing yourself to the harms and to the side effects and really to the costs without benefit.
And this is one thing that you did mention in the book. Do cholesterol screenings reduce the chance of death or hospitalization?
Absolutely not. In fact, the whole cholesterol screening paradigm has never been studied to see if it reduces heart attacks or strokes. Most of the cholesterol-lowering research has been funded by the pharmaceutical industry, who are testing individual drugs. Those studies often involve large numbers of patients. We're talking studies that have sometimes 5 or 8 or 10,000 people in them. And the effects of those of the drugs are very marginal. And in terms of taking large numbers of people and screening them and putting a certain portion of them on cholesterol-lowering drugs, then following them for years to see if you're actually preventing heart disease in those people, those tests have simply not been done. So the cholesterol screening paradigm which we're all living under is an uncontrolled experiment.
So at this point, there actually is no evidence.
Yeah.
And we'll be back to talk more with drug policy researcher Alan Cassels about his book, Seeking Sickness, Medical Screening and the Misguided Hunt for Disease, after this.
Skeptically Speaking wants you to question everything. To be a part of the discussion, call and record your question on our listener question line at Speak 73101. That's 773-257-3101. Long-distance charges may apply. Sunday nights at 6 Mountain Time, join our Ustream chat room to listen and ask questions as we record interviews live. Just click the Listen Online button at skepticallyspeaking.com. You can also email your questions and comments to live@skepticallyspeaking.com, or if you're on Twitter, tweet us at Skeptical Radio. To find out where Skeptically Speaking airs near you, to listen to past episodes, or download the weekly podcast, check out our website at skepticallyspeaking.com. While you're there, follow the links to connect with us on our Facebook page, our Twitter feed, or to subscribe to the show in iTunes. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Skeptically Speaking. I'm your host, Desiree Schell, and I'm here with Alan Cassels, a drug policy researcher affiliated with the School of Health Information Sciences at the University of Victoria, and he's the author of Seeking Sickness, Medical Screening and the Misguided Hunt for Disease. So, as you've pointed out, you don't just discuss cholesterol testing. You cover eyeball pressure and heart scanning, PSA testing, mammograms, mental health even, but it seems like it all basically comes down to the same thing. You claim that many of these tests are almost entirely unnecessary for people who are otherwise healthy or aren't predisposed for some reason to be high risk. Is that correct?
Right. Absolutely. People who have no symptoms are otherwise healthy, and but they might be worried, and I can't discount the fact that someone who has had, say, a sister who had breast cancer or a brother who had prostate cancer, for that person to be worried about whether they should be getting screened. And very legitimate question. If you've got certain family histories of certain diseases, having that chat with your doctor about whether screening benefits you is certainly worthwhile.
But the obvious question is, what if it did find something? If you were able to be screened for whatever the case, and you did catch something early enough to treat it? Regardless of everything else that you've said, wouldn't it be worth it? Well,
it would be worth it, but then you have to sort of say, what are the probability gains, right? So let me give you an example. With mammography, the goal there is not just to find cancer. I mean, if we wanted to find cancer, we would submit you to full body scans repeatedly until we found something unusual. I mean, the goal of mammography should be to prevent death by cancer. And so if you say that's the goal, you don't want people to die of breast cancer, then you have to say, well, how much do we have to do to prevent one death from breast cancer? And most of your listeners would be shocked at the statistics around that evidence. And here it is in a nutshell. You have to screen 2,100 women every year for 11 years to prevent one woman from dying of breast cancer. So that's a 1 in 2,100 chance of having your life saved by screening. In the course of that 2,100 women who are screened every year for 11 years, about 700 of them are going to have false positives. So those are women who are going to discover something unusual on the mammogram that's going to require a biopsy and sometimes surgery, and those women will not be helped. Those women will only be hurt. Their lives will not be saved. And so in the course, and of course then they're going to have to deal with, the psychological impact of having a cancer scare. And I can tell you, in all of the screening I've looked at, no one has ever studied the psychological impacts of telling someone they have a life-threatening disease when, in fact, they don't actually have it. And so, yes, breast cancer screening will save a life, but the question is it worth exposing 2,100 women to the annual radiation, to the risk of having a false positive, and the risk of psychological harm? And if women know this, if they know in advance that there are potential benefits, that is having your life saved, versus the potential harms, that is having a cancer scare or a false positive, then they can go into breast cancer screening with their eyes wide open.
Right.
They don't have to to say to the doctor, I'm going to leave it up to you and let you decide. They would do it from a position of an informed kind of consent, and from the position of an informed person making a rational decision.
We have a question from James.
What do you think of the home HIV test that recently went on the market?
You know, when I saw that advertised, the first question I have is probably the first question that I mentioned in my book about what you should ask if you're being exposed to a new screening test, and that is, what does the evidence say of its benefits? And you might say, well, where does one find the evidence? Who's assessed the evidence? Who actually looks at the research? In the U.S., you have the United States Preventive Service Task Force, and if you did a Google search, you would just search under USPSTF. In Canada, they have the Canadian equivalent, Preventative Health Services Task Force. They actually assess the evidence. And an HIV home screening test, I believe, has not yet been assessed by these independent bodies. So you might say, well, it might still be good. Should I wait until some independent body has weighed in on it? And I would say yes. But at the same time, you might want to say, what are the advantages of having a home test for HIV as opposed to going to a clinic or to a lab to get your blood work done? I'm not exactly sure what the benefits are of the different types, whether doing it at home versus getting it done. And of course, the question in any screening test is there a potential for the test to be wrong? Like, can the test be inaccurate and tell you that you have a condition when you don't have that condition, or giving you a false sense of reassurance? Though, home screening tests are absolutely becoming the wave of the future. The one that's probably most commonly used is the home pregnancy test, which any woman who thinks that she might be pregnant only has to look at the little dipstick to see what color it is, and that's relatively accurate, though you wouldn't sort of change your life on the basis of that home screening test. Right. You would at least say, okay, well, this is giving me a signal that I should probably go to my doctor and get the lab to actually do the assessment.
And we have another question from the audience. This is from Tony.
Many recent reports claim that PSA testing for prostate cancer causes more trouble than it's worth, yet my doctor insists that annual testing is necessary, even though I have no indications of any problems. Who should I believe?
Yeah, absolutely, and I have to admit, as a man who is approaching the age where my doctor will start offering this to me, I'm in the same boat. Though having researched PSA testing now for several years, I would say that if you are a middle-aged man with no symptoms and have been offered a PSA test, that's the time to start thinking about what the research says. Now, his doctor may be offering it, but I can tell you that there are a lot of doctors that I know that have simply stopped offering it to their male patients because they know the statistics that there's a good chance that their patient who's at a certain age will come back with a high reading, and that will cause all kinds of distress, and quite likely most of what they find will be of the low, slow-growing type. See, there's various types of prostate cancer. There's the very rapid and lethal type, and there are the very long and slow-growing non-lethal types. And most of what they will find when they do a PSA test is the latter. What men should know is that even though prostate cancer kills about 3% of men, so we have about a 3% lifetime risk of dying from prostate cancer, if we live long enough, most of us will get it, which is to say, most of us, if we live long enough, will have evidence of cancer cells in our prostates. As one doctor told me, most men will die with prostate cancer, but not because of it.
Interesting.
Yes.
You're listening to Skeptically Speaking. Today's guest is drug policy researcher Alan Cassels, author of Seeking Sickness, Medical Screening, and the Misguided Hunt for Disease. This is from Mary.
There's sort of a culture of the worried well developing. It seems it's not just the pharma and marketing side where this arises. Is that your sense too?
Absolutely. I wish I was the one who coined the term worried well. It is really troubling that even though most of us are living longer and healthier lives for many reasons, we are still probably much more medically neurotic as a society than we need to be. And you might say, well, what's causing all this neurosis? And, it's a complex range of things. But one thing that I would indicate as probably being the worst thing for our health is simply the amount of drug advertising we see on TV. And when I was researching my book, Seeking Sickness, I found that a statistic that really shocked me, which is the average American, and I would say in turn the average Canadian who watches a lot of American TV, the average American is exposed to 14 drug ads a day, pharmaceutical ads on TV. That's a huge amount of suggestion saying to you repeatedly, you may be sick, consult your doctor. Do you think it's depression? It could be bipolar. Do you possibly have Alzheimer's? Maybe you have attention deficit disorder or low testosterone. So this constant suggestion that you could be sick comes at us through the tube all the time. And that's just indicative of all kinds of marketing of drugs and diseases.
But that explains why patients want these screenings. But why are doctors requesting these screenings, especially if they do know the stats?
Right. Sometimes doctors request them, and again, that's a complicated situation. A lot of times physicians will be driven by guidelines, and the guidelines will say, for every woman 40 and over, you should be offering her an annual mammogram, and for every man over 50, you should offer him a PSA test. Those guidelines, I hate, this will sound somewhat conspiratorial, but I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and that is, the guidelines are put together very much by well-meaning, often professional societies, by urologists, for example, who might prepare guidelines on when to test for PSA screening. But those guideline writers have conflicts, which is to say urologists benefit from having men diagnosed with prostate cancer so that they can treat them. And so there is an overestimation on the benefits of the screening, and they're very much pushing the average doctor to follow these guidelines. Some of the doctors that I know are really quite fed up with the kinds of guideline-driven medicine that gets pushed in their faces, where they're being asked to give, 70-year-old, 80-year-old women tests for osteoporosis or high cholesterol when they know that those women are not going to benefit from those tests. And so, and some physicians, certainly in the U.S., might fear litigation, where if they don't offer the test and something goes wrong, that the patient's family or their estate will come back and sue them for not recommending the test. So there's that fear of litigation hanging over some physicians' heads. So, it's a reality.
And as you said, sometimes those guidelines do change, like with the Pap tests.
Absolutely, and the guidelines certainly around mammography and PSA testing have been changing over the years. It used to be that they would say every woman over 40 should get an annual mammogram. Now they're saying every woman over 50. So they've recognized that they have been too overzealous with who they're recommending for screening, and they're starting to back off. And I think that's a very good sign. I mean, it used to be 20 years ago that they would recommend that you get an annual physical and they do a chest X-ray on you to see if they can find any unusual things in your lungs. They don't recommend that anymore, and the reason is because most of us will have unusual things found in our lungs if we live long enough. And most of what they find is going to be a false positive. They don't recommend that kind of screening. That's a good thing.
And we'll try to get to one more question from Brian.
How do you suggest we reform medical screenings so that we don't make unnecessary medical interventions?
Yeah, very good question. I think that the best thing that we've got going for us so far in terms of reforming medical screening is we have good independent task forces, both in Canada and the U.S. When I say independent, these task force, this is the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, give fairly solid recommendations. The people who sit on the task force do not have conflicts of interest, so they don't stand to benefit from recommending screening or not. And they're just looking at the medical benefit. They're not looking at the cost. And that's a good thing. But, I think that the big reform that has to happen, and, that's why I wrote this book, Seeking Sickness, is that patients need to be informed, and people need to know that medical screening is not an emergency procedure. When you're offered a screening test, that's the time to start doing some research, having a conversation, thinking about the good questions you need to ask, and you don't have to rush into it. And I think that if people were to realize that there are a lot of limitations and a lot of potential harms to screening, then reform is going to get driven by the consumer, who's going to say, you know what, I don't want to have that screening test, or I don't think I'm going to benefit from that screening test, and physicians will stop offering them.
Now, you actually developed a list of 6 questions that you should ask to determine if it's something that you actually want to go through with a screening. So maybe could you go over those?
Yeah, well, so, and this was partly driven by the fact that I was sitting in an optometrist chair, offered a screening test for glaucoma, and I realized, oh my goodness, I'm on the pointy end of the screening test, and I didn't really have any reason to reject it, but I knew that they were looking for some signs of disease. So, and what could go wrong? So I guess in a nutshell, the first question that you would ask is, what do the independent bodies say about the screening being offered? And I recommend a number of these bodies in my book, such as the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. The other question being, is the disease being recommended? Is this something that is really prevalent enough that requires screening? And is there a sort of an accepted probability that you could have it? Or really is this a kind of low-risk fishing expedition that they're going on? Really, basically, do you have a chance to benefit from it? If they're looking for disease, will they be able to find it at a point that they can do something about? And I would say on that front, something like Alzheimer's screening really is very much a failure, because though they might be able to screen and say you have a higher than normal risk of developing Alzheimer's, there is no effective cure or prevention for it. So what benefit is that to you to know many years in advance that you may develop dementia when you get older? The other question being, is the test sensitive enough? Can it accurately find something that's worth doing something about, both with a low rate of false positives and false negatives? And then you have to ask, who's pushing the test? Kind of who's behind it? And certainly with stuff like PSA testing, you see urologists who are very much pushing major PSA testing on men, partly because they have a very strong financial interest in promoting that kind of screening. So you have to find out who's pushing it and why. And I think that the last thing being, you have to ask the question is, if they find a positive, if you undergo a screen and they find a positive test, then what happens? Essentially, is there something that they can do that you would find acceptable? And so those kinds of questions, I think, and I've got them listed in my book. Those kinds of questions, I think, apply to any kind of screening test.
Well, the who's pushing it point is difficult, though, because especially when we are talking about the pharmaceutical industry, it is a for-profit industry. So there's always going to be someone who is the one making the money off of this.
Right. So absolutely. So knowing that we can say, are the people behind the guidelines or the recommendations, do they have conflicts of interest? And your listeners might be shocked to know that the people who developed the cholesterol screening guidelines in Canada and in the U.S. have multiple ties to the pharmaceutical industry. So it's not that those recommendations are bad. It's just the people who are sitting down and telling you when you need to be screened for cholesterol are financially tied to companies that sell cholesterol-lowering drugs. So knowing that, I think, should raise everyone's level of skepticism, and hence the name of your radio program.
Now, I did actually want to point out something that you repeatedly mentioned in the book. The fact that socioeconomics is actually a far better indicator of almost every illness, it seems, than screening tests. Is that correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. When you think about who, all of us will die, but the question is who dies earlier than they should. And so you see that people who are poor or marginalized live in difficult circumstances and are really not good around what they call the social determinants of health. Maybe they have poor social networks, or they are isolated, or they eat poorly and they can't get enough exercise and kind of stimulation. Those people will always do worse than the rest of us. If we were really smart about trying to make society as healthy as possible, we'd say, well, let's try to reduce social inequities and try to improve the lot for everyone. And in fact, in countries where the social inequities are the lowest, everyone lives healthier and longer lives. It's in countries where you have serious inequities between rich and poor that you see large gaps between healthy and unhealthy.
I don't have any follow-up questions to that. I love that sentiment. So I'm wondering, what's the reaction been to your book? I guess by the medical community is what I'm most curious about. Do they generally agree, or are your ideas very controversial?
Well, amongst my friends who are doctors, they say, well, yeah, Alan's written another book, and good for him. No, they tend to agree with me. But I can tell you one thing that shocked me about this is that there was a major newspaper in Vancouver that was going to arrange for me to have a videotaped debate with a local leading urologist, and we were going to debate the issues of PSA testing. And I was very eager to do this because I'm thinking, this is the kind of thing that we need. We need public debates about this. And they had set it up. It was going to go ahead, and he suddenly got cold feet and pulled out of it. And so, this is probably one of the provinces of the country's leading urologists who simply won't even debate me on the issues. And that's, I find, very troubling, because if you've got stuff that's controversial and you're not willing to go forth and state your opinion and your expert evidence, I think that's a travesty. And so the reaction to my book has not been negative, though when people don't debate you on the facts or won't debate you on the issues, it scares me, because it makes me think maybe I'm right.
Well, I am not an expert myself, but it was a very interesting book, and we are officially out of time. So thank you, Alan, for being on the show.
I appreciate it. This has been very enjoyable. Thank you.
You can find the link to Alan Cassels, the author of Seeking Sickness, Medical Screening, and the Misguided Hunt for Disease, on our site at skepticallyspeaking.com. And for your information, Alan is happy to engage with people in the comment section of this episode. So head there if you have questions or you'd like to discuss the topics that we covered today. And we'll be right back with Michael Kruse to talk about the new science activist organization, Bad Science Watch, right after this.
On the next episode of Skeptically Speaking, we're looking at how the basic condition of not knowing things provides the motivation to keep science moving. We're joined by Stuart Firestein, chair of Columbia University's Department of Biological Sciences, to talk about his book, Ignorance, How It Drives Science. And we're joined by Toronto attorney Adam Wigodny to talk about using the law to protect consumers from ineffective and untested alternative medicine products. That's next week on Skeptically Speaking, on your local radio station, or online at skepticallyspeaking.com.
Welcome back to Skeptically Speaking. I'm your host, Desiree Schell, and I'm here with Michael Kruse, paramedic and co-founder of a new organization that I'm very excited about, Bad Science Watch. Welcome back to the show, sir.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. So,
what have you been up to, Michael?
Well, it seems like quite a bit. Last fall, around November, December, a friend of mine, Jamie Williams from Vancouver, and I decided that there was something missing in the science advocacy community in Canada, and that was a group that would be specifically focused on fighting for good science in public policy, from a lobbying perspective, really. And so we started working on a brand foundation, which is an explanation of all of our goals that we want this new organization to accomplish. And lo and behold, 7 months later, after quite a bit of work, we've launched a new national nonprofit activist group called Bad Science Watch. This is an organization that is focused on countering dubious claims for the government and in the media, and promoting critical thinking, and most importantly, fighting for the strengthening and enforcement of consumer protection legislation across Canada.
Oh, I like that.
Yes. We're really focused on real change, right? There are many organizations, or a few organizations that are fighting to educate the public, to really work on the in the public level at the grassroots to give people the information they need to make good choices. We're focused on the regulator, on the federal government, provincial government, different regulatory bodies within each provincial and federal government, and through the media, to force these organizations to pay more attention to good science and use it when they're making public policy decisions. Now, we're not focused on every scientific issue across the country. Since we've launched last week on July the 7th, we've gotten a bunch of calls to deal with sort of mainstream science issues as well. And there are several organizations already dealing with mainstream science. We are really focused on dubious science in the alternative medicine realm, for example, or in people who are fighting to confuse the matter in climate change, right? And those areas are really sort of left alone by many organizations fighting for mainstream science, and we hope to have a much bigger effect on the regulatory and consumer protection areas to keep people safe and to make sure that people are given the true freedom, to make a good decision when they're deciding the fate of their health for them and their family.
So now how exactly is this going to play out? What are you going to do physically?
Right. So we are very focused on the idea of short-term goal making. So instead of long, drawn-out, year-long, 2-3-year-long projects that have an unfocused or grandiose goal attached to them, we are really focused on small, incremental steps towards progress. So projects that we take on are going to be 2 to 3 months in duration each. If it's a larger project, it's going to be chunked, as it were, into smaller, achievable goals. I'll tell you about the projects we're specifically talking about, but we were really concerned about the way that these projects have been approached in the past, right? So in the past, volunteers didn't know what to expect. You sign up for a project, and 3 months later, things are still going on. We have no idea what our goals are, whether they've been met or not. We have no measurable levels of success. So we're really focused on making this a system, making it professional, making it efficient, making sure everybody who volunteers for the organization knows how much time they're going to be spending on a project, when the project's over, and then we'll be able to look back very quickly to see if we were successful. So short-term, 2 to 3 months projects are going to be our focus. Now, what are we going to be tackling? So we've got a couple projects in the hopper that we're going to be announcing officially in a couple weeks, but I can share them with you right now. The very first one we're going to be starting is an activist project centered around food intolerance testing. People may have heard about this, as drugstores in Canada are now starting to offer what was once a sort of specialty test. It's a blood test that measures what's called IgG, immunoglobulin G, which is supposed to test you for any intolerances that you may have for food. This test has been really unsupported by the current science. What they're testing for is not what the test is meant for. And what it does do is give the drugstore that is giving you the test the ability to create a custom list of supplements that you will need to replace the foods that you are restricted from after this test is over. So we really see this kind of testing as as taking advantage of the consumer, right? It's oversold. The test is oversold, and also gives the drugstore the ability to sell you something at the end that you don't in fact need. So we feel that that's a really strong consumer protection problem, and we're going to be taking that on, trying to get these tests properly either regulated or to let the public know that they're useless and to drive them away from those stores that have them. Now, that is an activist grassroots project, but it's going to allow us to do something quickly, test out our mechanism, because that's important. We have no idea if this new kind of activist model of science advocacy is going to work. And so this will allow us to test that out and get people involved and make real change, and then bring this to the regulator so we can actually get some changes to the consumer protection regulation as well.
So is this also going to include things like writing policy papers and such?
It will, to a certain extent. Now, we do have some longer-term goals. We're going through a process of where we want to see the country in 5 years and 10 years as far as the regulations go for alternative medicine and natural health products. So this will include that, certainly. But those will be tools to actually lobby the government for change, as opposed to a think tank that just publishes papers, position papers, that then just end at the front door of that facility. These will be tools that we're going to be using to promote these ideas at the government level and actually affect change. So what we're trying to do is reach out to the public and get their support. Now, policy papers can be quite dry, can be quite academic, and we're not trying to alienate people from the information we're trying to spread. So while the idea in the past has been to just sort of get a whole bunch of facts and make sure they're right and maybe someone will believe you, we're hoping to use those facts to tell a better story and keep people involved to actually promote good health. So while that'll be certainly a component, and everything that we want to do will be science-based, and we will have science advisors that will be letting us know that we're representing the consensus science. Well, when we want to get the facts right, we also want to get the story right, so people will actually be motivated to change things.
I have a productivity crush on you right now.
Yes, that's true. Thank you.
So how can we help? That's the big question.
Yes, indeed. Well, there's several ways to help. The very first thing that we've done is we've launched a project on peerbackers.com. You can find that link on the donate button on our website at badsciencewatch.ca. We're trying to raise $6,000 in 30 days, which will pay for our operating expenses for the year and the budgets for our first two projects. This is important because we want to make sure that the community is behind us, and we want to promote the idea of efficiency and a respect for the donor. The other ways, you can get involved as a volunteer. You can email us at info@badsciencewatch.ca. That will alert our executive director. And you can certainly sign up for our mailing list, which will make you a recipient of our action alerts to allow you to get involved in a quick way online and to receive our email newsletters to see what we're up to and to see if you want to get involved.
I love this. I believe I said that, but I'm going to say it again because I love this.
Well, thank you. We really hope that people respond as well as you did, and we're looking forward to building the organization over the next several years.
I am looking forward to seeing what you do. So thanks very much for being on the show, Michael.
Thank you very much, Desiree. Have a great day.
There are more details at badsciencewatch.ca or at the link on our site at skepticallyspeaking.com. While you're there, you are greatly encouraged to click the links to Twitter, Facebook, and Google+, so that you can keep up with show news, and of course to iTunes, where you can download an episode or subscribe to the show. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week on Skeptically Speaking.
Bring it on, the skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell, gonna raise a little hell, break the spell of Pavlov's spells. Cause we're skeptically speaking, our mind reading tarot cards and witches, psychics, and their spoon-bending mind tricks. All the humbug, flim-flam, frauds and shams, the charlatan woo. I don't think you understand, it's the hocus pocus, out of focus locus, eroding the brain, making gains on the hopeless. Let the crystal ball fall, smash on the floor, leave the pieces alone, we don't need them anymore. Just a microscope, telescope, magnifier, reading in between the lines of these lies. Bring it on, the skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell, gonna raise a little hell, metaphorically that is. Cause we're skeptically speaking.